Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Today, I'm going to take a look at Africa because President Macron is leaving Paris on his next Africa trip. And he's going to be going to Gabon, where he's going to participate in a major African meeting on the environment, particularly looking at water resources and reforestation as Africa experiences climate change. Then he's going to go on to Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and finally Angola. The latter is not a former French colony. It's an old Portuguese colony. But the fact that Macron is going there and not going to the places where you would think that he would go, the well-known former French colonies like Ivory Coast or Senegal or Benin or Chad, says a lot about the new French approach to the region. It's to be more expansive, to cover all of Africa, and to take the emphasis away from the old French policy of security, of often buttressing the regime in place, even cosseting the regime in place, or being seen to be simply exploiting its own direct interests, for example, in uranium from Niger for its nuclear power program, or raw materials or markets. This time round, President Macron is talking about a new French policy based on partnerships, based on engagement with civil society, engagement with youth, standing up for human rights, dealing with anti-corruption and so on. And being more in the background when it comes to security. In a speech at the Élysée Palace before he departed for Africa last Monday, Macron outlined the new French Africa policy. He said that in security, France will still keep troops in Africa, about 5,000, and some of those, of course, will have to be relocated away from where they were before in Mali or the Central African Republic or Burkina Faso, because those countries have made it clear that they want the French to leave. But the function of the French forces will no longer be directly to fight jihadists, but to train the local forces to be more in the background. Macron even said that some of the French bases would be turned into academies. Now, this attempt by Macron to sort of reboot the French policy and the French image in the region is very much in line with what we see from other countries at the moment, Western countries, when it comes to Africa. For instance, the United States in the summit that President Biden convened last November is also talking about new forms of partnership, new private sector engagement, more focus on technology sharing, particularly, for example, in developing new sources of energy like nitrogen, more listening to what the Africans have to say and not being seen to be dictating to them, more help with, for example, health resilience in the wake of the COVID pandemic. So why is everybody suddenly trying to be nice to Africa and to suggest a much broader based long-term engagement? Well, the answer, I think, is a clear awareness that Africa may be sliding more into the camp of the authoritarians, particularly Russia and China. Last week, we had another vote in the UN General Assembly where, yes, the good news was that 141 countries voted to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. But two African countries, Eritrea and Mali, now supported Russia, and about 17 countries sort of sat on the fence, in other words, declaring that they were neutral. This would be a disappointment for the West after all of the efforts that it's made recently to engage with Africa and come up with new forms of cooperation. For example, on the eve of the UN vote, the G20 was meeting in India, and there the Western countries, led by Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, was looking at debt forgiveness for African countries, particularly countries like Zambia and Ghana, which are facing particular liquidity problems at the moment. So there is a feeling in the West that maybe all of these efforts are not really being welcomed by Africa, and the West is not yet getting the payback. Africa, of course, continues perhaps to see that it's the victim of the Ukraine war in terms of the impact on inflation or energy prices, food supplies on the continent. It probably thinks that this is the West's war, it's not its own struggle. And it probably is quite staggered that the West is putting so many resources in Ukraine, particularly in arms of finance, which the African conflicts, and there are many of them, as we all know, rarely receive. So the perception of double standards may be behind this move, but it certainly means that the West now has to come up with a major rethink long term about how it engages Africa and how does it win African hearts and minds back on its side. What can be, for example, the persistent engagement in helping Africa to solve its conflicts? What can be, for example, the way in which the West can support the new structures in Africa, particularly the African Union, to deal with issues like coups, for example, or to be more involved in peacekeeping? Can we persuade Africans that, the alternative, which is Wagner mercenaries, to French or Western soldiers in fighting jihadists and keeping the peace, doesn't work any better? For example, in Burkina Faso, since the French left, the Burkina Faso soldiers have been dying in large numbers in ambushes at the hands of jihadists in the north of the country. Wagner also may carry a heavy price tag in terms of the exploitation of mines and mineral resources. Can we be firm on anti-corruption, because Russia and China tend to have the greatest influence in countries where there is the greatest corruption? Can we encourage more business and investment, particularly by Africans, given that this is a continent where the GDP per capita is still around $2,000 and where 50% of the people still lack electricity? And finally, can we put maybe a more neutral face of our own on this engagement? Not always the ex-colonial powers fronting these operations, but for example, in the EU, using more Finns or Swedes or Czechs or Slovaks or Poles from European countries which don't have a colonial past and therefore may find it easier to build bridges. There are no easy answers to these issues, and I'll talk about them in more detail in future editions of The Eye, but it's quite clear that Africa is a continent where there is still everything to be played for. Thank you for watching and listening today. I look forward to engaging with you again next week.